capital cities. Do they deserve a team? Well, you got state capitals and you got provincial capitals, and of course, you got capitals of the two major players, Canada and the United States. For Canada, Ottawa had a great AAA baseball team called the Ottawa Lynx, which helped Montreal and Baltimore out years ago. Basketball, the NBA didn't seem to want to come to Ottawa, even for an exhibition game. Football, the CFL, Ottawa had their team with the Rough Riders, and then they folded, and then they became the Renegades, and then they folded, and then turned into the Red Blacks, who are in the CFL and all that. But the NFL doesn't really have a thing with Ottawa. And in hockey, the old Ottawa Senators from 1917 to 1934, before they were forced to move because of the Great Depression to St. Louis. And then they didn't get a sniff of an expansion team until 1992, of all things. And they've been decent. They made the playoffs, though. It comes to the U.S. Capitol and all that. Washington for baseball had been taken out twice. 1960, the Senators moved to Minnesota, and then they were given an expansion team back in Washington, but that team was sold by Bob Short to Texas and all that. And then they had to wait till 2005 and the downfall of the Montreal Expos to get their franchise back. And then for football, it's hail to the redacted and all that. And then you got yourself basketball. The Washington Bullets turned into the Wizards because of the crime in Washington for the Wizards, and they did win an NBA title. And of course, the hockey team, the Washington Capitals, or as I call them, the Capitals. They started off auspiciously, and they've been very much snake bit, one of the most snake bit franchises around. But at least they have a Stanley Cup, unlike Toronto. So anyhow, let's talk about the Washington Capitals and one of their great chances to do well, and not 2025. We're talking about 2010. Hello out there, we're on the air. It's Cutter with NHL time. Tensions blow, the whistle blown, and the pucks go down the ice. Some teams just want to win the cup and do it with a smile. Hey, that is cool. Up on the River Nile. Oh, the good old hockey game. Who will come out on top? Will a team get through the cup to the cup by any means necessary? Oh, the good old hockey game. It's the best game you can name, and I'm have no shame. I will simulate those hockey games. Woo! So the Washington Capitals um, came into play in 1974 in the NHL. They made an expansion team. In the 70s, there were teams like having insolvency and then you had financial trouble and all that stuff. But the NHL kept expanding, and in 1974, they were expanded two cities, Washington and Kansas City. Kansas City had a good minor league hockey following, and Washington had a decent following. And I mean, you want to give the NHL their flowers in Washington and have at least three major league teams in Washington. You had the football team, you had the basketball team, and of course, baseball team just lost their team a couple years prior. And it wouldn't be until 2005 before baseball was back in the nation's capital, the U.S. nation's capital. Of course, I'm Canadian. So anyway, Washington had their first season. They drafted Mike Marson in the first round. How often do you see a black player being drafted in the first round in the 1970s in hockey? Baseball was obvious, basketball was obvious, football was obvious, but hockey didn't really catch much of a color barrier, unfortunately. So Washington had a decent roster. They had Ron Lowe, who would go on to be a goalie for the Oilers and would actually be a good GM/coach for the Oilers. You had John Adams in net, not the former president, and you had Michel Belhumeur. In French, his last name meant good humor, and not the good humor ice cream bars, but like take things in good humor. But Belhumeur spent two seasons with the Capitals, never winning a game. He had four ties, but he never won a game. Washington's winning ways was not that great either. They had 8 wins. They had 8 wins in the 74-75 season. In 80 games, they only won 8 times, tying four. Of course, in the NHL between 1942 and 1983, regular season games did not go to overtime. They ended in ties. Of course, in the overtime happened in the playoffs. So Washington had won only one of their 10 games and all that. Not even the Sharks or Senators in 1993 were that pathetic. The Sharks won 10 games, and the Senators won a bit more. They had more points than Washington did. It's, it's basically one of the worst modern day records. Heck, not even the California freaking Golden Seals were close to being that bad. But anyway, Washington bounced back. By 1982, they were making the playoffs and all of that. Ron Langway was a savior in a sense because the Habs traded him to Washington for Rick Green and all that. And Montreal gave a two-time Norris Trophy winner away. And we're thinking, well, what would have happened if Montreal kept Ron Langway? But you got to also remember too that Toronto traded away Randy Carlo, and he won a couple of Norris trophies with Pittsburgh. So anyhow, Washington got back to the playoffs and all that. They had Gary Green, who was like 30 years old when he was hired as coach, which was weird and all that. Yvon Lebra lasted 7 seasons, and they decided to give him his jersey retirement. Is he worthy of jersey retirement? Well, you tell that to a Washington fan and they'll beat the shit out of you. Washington was decent in the 80s. They made the playoffs. They were victimized in 1987, the worst, when they had a 3 games to 1 lead on the New York Islanders, but blew it. They lost the last 3 games, and Game 7 was the Easter epic, in which Pat LaFontaine in the fourth overtime beat Bob Mason. And no, that's not the what if. I know that Washington blew a 3-1 series lead and all that, but that's not the what if I'm talking about. And then in 1992, they had the defending Stanley Cup champion Pittsburgh Penguins on the ropes with a 3-1 series lead. And guess what happened? That's right, they choked that. So, and Pittsburgh went on. Well, Pittsburgh won the last 3 games against Washington. Was it 92? Yeah. And then they were in trouble against the Rangers, but won the next 3. And then they swept Boston and Chicago to win 11 straight games. Washington, I believe in 1995, also had a 3-1 series lead, I think, and let it fly against Pittsburgh. I don't know. Who's in my head? Yeah, Washington was victimized in quadruple overtime by Peter Nedved in 1996 in Game 4. But Washington kept trying. 97, they were doing things. They were changing their jersey to the Screaming Eagle. In 1998, they shocked everyone, including themselves, by winning the Eastern Final against the Buffalo Sabres because Buffalo had Dominic Hasek, who was coming off an MVP season. But Brian Bellows, Kitchener, scored a pair of overtime goals in the thing. And then Joey Juneau was the hero in Buffalo to get Washington to the Stanley Cup Finals against Detroit. Unfortunately, they got swept in 4. What's worse for Washington is that Game 2, they had like a 5-2 lead, 4-2 lead, and they choked it. And Chris Draper, of all people, scored the winning goal in overtime. And Gary Thorne went on the ESPN call, said the only forward who hadn't scored a goal has just scored one. Because Detroit had some decent scoring. Anyway, so Detroit swept Washington in the series. It was nice to see Vladdy Konstantinov, who had that accident and nearly died, but he got to carry the cup in his wheelchair. Washington, though, would keep trying to make the finals and all that, try to do their best, but they kept falling in the second round. For 20 years, Washington just couldn't get to the conference final. Small potatoes compared to the Leafs with their 23-year end counting streak. Washington, well, Kuznetsov scored a key goal against Pittsburgh and finally got Washington to the conference final, which they beat Tampa, and then they went to the 2018 Stanley Cup Finals against Vegas. Vegas won Game 1, and everyone was shocked because Vegas was his expansion team, and everyone was just shocked. But unfortunately, Washington won the next 4 and won the cup, and basically, Washington fans finally got their cup. Their long-suffering ways were over. Ha! Try being a Leaf fan. Of course, Washington had some great snipers. Peter Bondra, Dale Hunter was on that team. He was a decent goal scorer, but it was a penalty minute taker and the guy who fucking almost killed Pierre Turgeon in a sense in 1993 playoffs and got himself a 21-game suspension. Well deserved, man. So anyway, yeah. And then of course the grade eight Alshon Fetchkin, who was the number one draft pick in the 2004 draft. He couldn't play his rookie year because 2005 was the strike year. So he was a rookie alongside the other number one draft pick, Sidney Crosby. It was Ovi versus Crosby, and Ovi won the Calder. People forget that Crosby didn't win the Calder for Rookie of the Year. Ovi, of course, broke the goal scoring record this past year. I'm a little pissed off because, I'm a Canadian nationalist and Wayne Gretzky should have kept that record. But he'll get the assist record and the points record because Ovechkin doesn't get a lot of assists. Ovechkin might wind down soon, who knows? But nevertheless, let's talk about the 2010 Washington Capitals and one of their biggest jokes. So the 2010 Capitals, this was their 36th season in the NHL. Ovechkin was named team captain. The Capitals traded away their captain Chris Clark to Columbus for Jason Chimera. Ovi became the first European captain in team history, and the second youngest. Washington looked good. They won the President's Trophy with 121 points and becoming the first non-original 16 to hit 120 points. They were looking pretty good for themselves. And all that. So yeah, they had the regular season and all that, 14 straight wins. They scored all those goals. They crushed the Southeast Division because when the NHL had six divisions, three in each conference, Washington easily won their division. Atlanta was one game above 500, but they couldn't make the playoffs for shit. So Washington 121 points. They crushed the East. The Devils had 103 points for second place, 18 points ahead of the Devils. They would take on the Canadiens, who just snipped the New York Rangers up the line for 87 points. Of course, the Flyers Rangers did play in the final game, and winner got to go to the playoffs, and the Rangers lost in the shootout. So the Capitals looked pretty good, including 13-2 in January. But in the playoffs, they were looking pretty good. You got Montreal and all that. Montreal won game one, no big deal. They got rid of Theodore and went with Varlamov for the rest of the series. Capitals won game two at home in overtime 6-5, so it looked pretty good. And then games three and four, they looked pretty awesome. And it looked good for Washington to make it through Montreal. But for some strange reason, Montreal decided to wake up, score seven. Yeah, sure, they scored 8 goals in 3 games, which isn't good in a sense. But the Capitals, the high scoring Capitals, were held to 3 goals in 3 games. Halak woke up and helped the Habs win the series. Montreal would then go on a magical run. They beat Pittsburgh. They could have beaten Philadelphia in the conference finals, but fucking didn't. It was the first time the conference finals had the 7 versus the 8 because the two lowest seeds were fighting each other. Ovi had a decent playoff in 7 games. And all that. Varlamov was the goalie. Well, Theodore was the goalie in the playoffs, and then they just in the regular season. Then they decided to go with Varlamov. Um, Ovi won the Ted Lindsay Award for MVP as selected by the players. I don't know who won the actual heart. I think it was Crosby. I don't know. Jose Theodore won the Masterton because he was coming back from some kind of disease and all that. They made the Jason Chimera trade, like I said. At the trade deadline, they picked up Scotty Walker from Carolina for a 7th-round pick, Eric Belanger for a 2nd-round pick from Minnesota, and Jared Corville from Carolina for a pair of players and a 2nd-round pick in 2011. Mike Kadubel signed a 2-year deal out of the Flyers to free agency. Brandon Morrison went from Dallas to Washington. They did lose Sergei Fedorov to Russia for a couple of years. Victor Kozlov went to Russia. Donald Brashear went to the Rangers. And Brent Johnson went to Pittsburgh. They made some moves. They picked up Marcus Johansson in the 1st-round pick in 2009, and he played well. He's one of the best assist men in Washington history. Dmitry Orlov went 2nd round. He's pretty good. Cody Eakin also was there. So yeah. So Washington had everything in their power. 54, 15, and 13, and yet they blew it by not finishing off the Habs when they needed to. They were up 3 games to 1 and choked it. But this would not be the last time Washington had a 3-1 series lead and choked it. 2013, first round against the New York Rangers. They had a 3-1 series lead and choked it. So I think Washington holds the record for most 3-1 series leads choked away. I think, like 5. Nevertheless, we're going to talk about the 2010 Caps and we're going to do the what if. Anyhow, so the 2010 Flyers would have taken the 2010 Caps because the Flyers were the 7 seed and won their first round match. They take on Washington, who's the 1 seed, and all that. Boston would take on Pitt. Who would Boston take on? Yeah, Boston would take on Pittsburgh. And guessing by my thing, I would go with Boston. I would have said Boston would get in. So who will face Boston? So anyway, so it's Boucher versus Varlamov because those are the goalie things for the playoffs. And the Capitals crushed the Flyers 8-1 as Chris Pronger did score for the Flyers. Remember, he was in the Flyers. Mike Green, Alex Semin, and Alex Ovechkin made it 3-1. Ovi scored. Matt Bradley made it 5-1. Not Shane from Smosh. Not Shane Top. Boucher is replaced by Jan Backlund. Not by Ray Emery. Anyway, Tamara Fear and Mike Green made it 8-1. Danny Savret, Ryan Perrant, and Jared Ross only played like a minute. Washington gave Chris Clark 2 minutes, Tyler Sloan 2 minutes, Joe Corville, Toronto's and Scott Walker 39 seconds. Could have given him more time. Semin, Green, and Pody, your 3 stars. Game 2, the Flyers trust Boucher and win 5-1. Scott Hardo was ejected for elbowing, but the Flyers scored the first 3 goals. Simon Gagne, Danny Briere, and JVR, James Van Riemsdyk. Ovi made it 3-1. Pronger and Colburn ended it 5-1 as Boucher had a great bounce back game. Gagne and Carter also were 3 stars. So Boucher. So it's 1-1 headed to game 3 in Philadelphia, and the Flyers win 4-1 as Nick Backstrom scored. But then Mike Richards, Kitchener, made it 1-1. Jeff Carter and JVR scored, make it 4-1. Van Riemsdyk, Richards, and Boucher, the 3 stars. So Brian Boucher would have done great. Game 4 went to the Capitals 3-2 as Ovi scored twice. Then Carter, then Mike Green made it 3-1. Pronger made it 3-2. So it's 3-2 as Ovi, Boucher, and Green were the 3 stars. Boucher did give up 48 shots. So it's 2-2 head back to Washington. And it was Washington winning 5-3 to force a game 6. Flyers had goals by, well, Chris Pronger scored 2 goals. Jeff Carter scored 1 in the first period. Semin and Ovi made it 3-2. Ovi tied it at 3. Semin and Chimera were the heroes, in a sense. Ovi, Semin, and Pronger are your 3 stars. So game 6 in Philadelphia. Philly, well, might as well keep going with Boucher. And the Capitals won game 6, 6-4. So Washington would have went to the conference finals against Boston. Hartnell got ejected for headbutting, which was the beginning of the end. Ovi, Green, and Brandon Morrison scored to make it 3-2. Pronger scored twice. For the Flyers. Briere and Brookside for 3. Backstrom scored, and Boucher was replaced. Gagne made it 5-4. Aaron Ashland was hit with a goalie interference call, and Lucas Krajcek gets hit with an unsportsmanlike conduct penalty for the rest of the game. Semin scored the winning goal, and that was it. Green, Ovi, and Semin are your 3 stars, and Washington goes to the next round. They'll face Boston. I don't know why that sits 2. I think they screwed up the number. So yeah, the Boston Bruins of 2010. Tuukka Rask is your goalie of note against Varlamov. Game number 1. Sees Washington win 4-2. All their goals in the first period. Knuble, Semin, Belanger, and Belanger. Stern made it 4-1, and then Stern made it 4-2. Eric Belanger, eh? Belanger, Stern, and White, your 3 stars. Game 2. sees Washington win again 4-2. As Fear scored for Washington, Krejci looks like Blake Wheeler. Blake Wheeler! Jeff Schultz made it 3-2, and Eric Ferris scored in the empty net. So Boston's in trouble. They're down 2-0. Fuhrer, Raskin, Krejci, the 3 stars. So Washington getting momentum against Boston. And they sure did. They win 6-1 in game 3. Only giving up a goal in the third period. But Fair, Ovi, Backstrom, Ovi, and then Jeff Schultz put Tuca out of the net. Semin made it 6-0, and then Mike Recchi scored to make it 6-1. Green 7 and Ovi, your 3 stars. Varlamov should have gotten a star, but nope, he didn't. Game 4, Tim Thomas will have to come in the net. And it worked. Boston won. Bergeron and Wheeler made it 2-0. Sturm made it 3-0. Canuvo and Mike Green, the 2 Mikes, made it 3-2, but Patrice Bergeron shut them down 4-2. As Bergeron, Sturm, and Green are your 3 stars. Game 5 back in Washington. And it would be a blank screen. But Washington wins game 5 4-2. As Backstrom and Belanger and Eric Ferrer made it 3-0. Lucic made it 3-1. Brooks Lake made it 4-1. And Danny Paille 4-2. So the Bruins couldn't do anything. Green, Canubo, Varlamov, your 3 stars. And Washington would face the Chicago Blackhawks in the final because that was the Western champs, and we don't touch that. Niemi would be the goalie. A lot of people were thinking it's Crawford. Well, actually, no, Crawford was just a youngin. So Chicago would head to Washington for game 1. Washington would win in overtime. Semin scored, and Patrick Kane, Jonathan Toews made 2-1, and then late in the third, Semin scored, and then Eric Ferrer at 6:33 of overtime from Morrison and Fleischman. Well, that's not fair. It was. Semin, Brian Campbell, and Eric Ferrer are your 3 stars. Guess because 2 assists for Campbell? Okay. Game 2. Washington loses in overtime. Fleischman scored for Washington, then Kane, Blake, and Canubo made it 3-1. Tace and Brower made it 3-3. Overtime, Kim Janssen, after Ovi was in the box, scored on a rebound assist by Patrick Kane, 4-3. So Chicago splits in Washington. Kane, Taze, and Lake, your 3 stars. Headed to Chicago for game 3. And game 3 would be Chicago's 4-2 as Versteeg scored in the first period. Backstrom tied it, and then Andrew Ladd made it 2-1. Patrick Kane made it 3-1, then Versteeg 4-1. The guy that the Leafs overpaid to get him. Eric Fair made it 4-2. 3 stars for Versteeg, Barker, and Backstrom. Game 4 sees the Capitals lose 4-2 as Morrison and Ovi did made it 2-0. Then Taze and Sharp made it 2-2. So Brian Campbell and Matt Barley were both booted for 2 minutes, but then Cam Parker got himself in trouble and got it unsportsmanlike. That woke up the Blackhawks. Versteeg and John Madden. Boom! Made it 4-2. So anyway, Taze, Versteeg, and Kane are your 3 stars of the day, and the Blackhawks are now looking pretty good. Is it 3-1? Or is it 2-1? It's 3-1, right? I think so. Yeah, it's 3-1, isn't it? Yeah, it's 3-1. Oh, I guess so. Yeah, it is 3-1. So Washington decides to use Theodore in the net because why not? And that's why not. And Capitals would have fallen to the Blackhawks. The Hawks would have won the series in 5, and Taze and King would have gotten the cup. Washington would have blown their chance, but at least they would have made the final. Capitals did get 2 goals, Nick Baxter and Brooks Lake, but Madden, Ladd, Kane, and Ebbett. Remember Andrew Ebbett? I don't. So the Blackhawks would have won the Stanley Cup, and Washington at least would have made the final, but they would have been shut down thanks to Niemi with Ebbett and Ladd, the 2 Andys. So Washington would have ended up losing the Stanley Cup final, and all of America would rejoice. Do they need their nation's capital to win a championship? Probably not. Anyhow, I'm Jeff. I'm going to do